Thank you. Thank you, Jared, and good morning to all of you. My name is Joey Minervini, and I'm the Public Affairs Manager for the Americas here at the Global CCS Institute. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about the climate and community benefits of CCS. 2021 and 2022 were really exciting years for CCS because of the two huge pieces of legislation that were passed, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Both had remarkable funding for CCS projects and infrastructure, policy provisions for CCS that have really shifted the ground in terms of enabling growth of the industry. And so for the last couple of years, those pieces of legislation have kind of sucked the air out of the room. And it seems to be that's what a lot of people have been focusing on, and rightly so, because there are still questions about how the incentives will work in practice, and there's still legislative work to do, and so on. Also in that time, as more people have learned about carbon management and CCS and CDR, and as projects are starting to be deployed across the country, we've heard some concerns about the technologies from the public or from NGOs. And there are lots of arguments out there about CCS, and some are not supported by data or fact. And so I wanted to pull together a panel with the expertise that could reinforce what we already know about CCS and the role it has to play in climate mitigation. Also speak to the things we're learning about that role of CCS in climate mitigation, and to establish some facts about CCS, especially with respect to the potential benefits it can have on communities. And so we have a fantastic group of experts joining us today. We have Chris Gregg, a senior research scientist at the Endlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. Andres Clarence was unable to join us today. We have Angela Seligman, senior carbon capture policy manager at the Clean Air Task Force. We have Jack Andresen, Manager, Carbon Management, U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. So thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to take the first portion of our time to speak with each of you about your work and experience, and then we'll take some time following that to open it up to the audience for questions. And I think we have a slide advancer here. Chris, I'd like to begin the discussion with you. Both the IPCC and the IEA have told us through multiple reports that CCS will need to reach multi-gigaton scale by 2050 if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. And you and your colleagues at Princeton also considered the same questions in 2021, asking what's it going to take to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And so I'd like to have you tell us, if you can, a bit about the consistent messaging we're hearing from the international science community, and also about your Net Zero America study and the conclusions you and your team came to with respect to CCS.
Sure.
Sorry, will you just get to your slides?
Yeah.
Yep. Let me go back one.
Oh. Yeah, so this slide's really interesting. What we've done here is pull together all of the models from the IPCC. These are integrated assessment models that involve keeping global average temperatures to below 1.5 degrees C growth. And so, there's a whole bunch of these IPCC models that actually don't achieve that goal, but this is the 61 model runs that will keep us within 1.5 degrees C. And so you can see there are none that have no CCS. There are a few outliers at the bottom that might involve 2 or 3 gigatons per year. But they also involve heroic energy efficiency conservation measures. Things like having the whole equatorial belt set air conditioning set points at 28 degrees C in summer and things like that. So massive behaviour change. But the 90% of those scenarios variously involve between 7 and 17 gigatons per year by 2050. The median's over 10. We reach 17 median by 2100. So, this is an enormous enterprise. If you were to convert these estimates to equivalent reservoir volumes for oil and gas, it's a bigger enterprise than the current oil and gas enterprise around the world. So it really is a huge expectation. And there really is no credible models that don't involve serious amounts of CCS. So I think, you know, it's one of these things I've always said, I think CCS is a really hard thing to do, but it's an essential thing to do if we are going to meet these climate goals. So that's kind of the international picture. If you want to skip forward, you know, for the US, the study I'm most familiar with is our Net Zero America study that we released at Princeton in 2021, and which had, you know, had a huge amount of media impact and still gets cited in The Economist and so forth every other month. So it really has had a remarkable impact. And, you know, across all of those scenarios, we range from somewhere between, we ran 5 core scenarios, somewhere between 0.7 of a gigaton and 1.7 gigatons per year by 2050. That's just for continental US. And so this gives you a picture on this slide here of where we are today with, you know, some pipelines that are transporting CCS for EOR and a couple of other small projects, and roughly where our assessment of the most credible large-scale storage potential is. And if you skip forward on there, this shows you what we end up with in our middle-of-the-road scenario in 2050. So 1 billion tonnes a year of CCS, so it's 1,700 capture facilities capturing from bioenergy, cement, natural gas power plants, blue hydrogen plants, etc., some chemical plants, around the country and having this 1 billion tonnes a year stored. It also involved 100,000 miles of new pipelines. It involved, you know, this 1 billion tonnes, so that's thousands of injection wells. And you know, on the bottom left-hand side there, you can see for the various scenarios what the build-up of CCS was. So, you know, we really think across most of the credible scenarios, we need to see several 100 million tonnes a year by 2030. This is in operation injecting, right, if we're going to be able to get to 1 billion. So really an enormous enterprise for the US as well as the globe. And, you know, I think the only other thing I would add here is we tried to run the model in a way that disallowed any CCS. We can't solve it, right? And it's a cost optimization model, so, you know, we were prepared to relax that constraint to any cost. We still couldn't solve it. So, you know, I don't know what more to say other than it's hard, but we're going to have to do it somehow.
Well, I think that's a really important message that I was hoping to reinforce today, so thank you. One question, and you may not be able to answer hypotheticals, but your team made some assumptions in the modeling about costs, things like inflation or natural gas prices. How do you think the real variations in those variables might have changed the outcomes of the study, or what has changed or what has remained the same since the time you published? Yeah,
so we actually produced the draft report almost final 2 weeks ahead of the Biden administration coming to power. So, and we released a final report 6 months later. The reality is the biggest thing that's changed are tailwinds in the form of policy, right? Back then, Build Back Better was not even an idea, IRA wasn't an idea. So, you know, we wanted this study to actually be something that might inform some of the early policy that came out of the administration, and we like to think we did have some influence on that. So that's the biggest tailwind that's behind, I think, the whole decarbonised adventure in the US, renewables, CCS, industrial decarbonisation, etc. But there's a bunch of headwinds as well. The biggest one is probably inflation and the cost of capital. If you remember, when we released this, we were on the back of 20 years of historically low interest rates. I said to my colleagues at the end, I said, we need to run a sensitivity to really high costs of capital. And the answer, they're all young, right? The answer was, why? You know, look at the curve for the last 20 years. And I say, yeah, well, let's look back 40 years. And, you know, people like me were borrowing houses at 18%. Okay, so that's had a big impact because these are really capital intensive. This scenario that I'm showing you here with the 1 billion tonnes, that is coupled with 3 terawatts of wind and solar. right? So 1,500 gigawatts each of wind and solar. And so the renewable sector is much more capital intensive than the traditional sector. So if you see increasing inflation, increasing costs of capital, which have all roughly doubled, you know, since before 2020, that's going to have an enormous impact on the investment decisions to get made here. So I think that's a big one. Not so much in the US, but of course energy prices, particularly natural gas prices in Europe and Asia, has been another big headwind, which, you know, I think in some ways is driving us towards accelerating the transition, but it's holding back potentially some CCS activities because the cost of the natural gas, and people are starting to think about other things like nuclear, for example. You know, I'm an Australian originally, and over there, it's all the papers want to talk about is the answer here is nuclear. You know, it's one side of politics has this view. So I think it's natural gas prices in other than the US has been a real distraction on the energy transition. And then the last big headwind that's something I think's really come on since 2021, 2020, is this growing movement as an opposition to development. On the one hand, I'd like to say it's an anti-fossil movement, it's an anti-CCS, but you know, it's actually affecting all infrastructure. It's affecting transmission, it's affecting wind and solar. I think it's like 120 or 130 counties now have effective bans on wind and solar, and that's growing rapidly just in the last couple of years. So I think, you know, the policy has been the policy environment here, and it's inspired, as Jared said, it's inspired stuff in the EU and elsewhere, is a real tailwind. But I think the headwinds are probably countering them pretty effectively right now.
Thank you, and I hope we can explore the model during the Q&A session. But now I'd like to turn to you, Angela, if I may. I mentioned in the opening that we're hearing, and Chris has just mentioned it here, that we're hearing some concerns about CCS from the public or NGOs. And one of the things I've heard out there at various public fora is that CCS will increase air pollution. Your team at the Clean Air Task Force looked into this with your 2023 study, Air Pollutant Reductions from Carbon Capture. What did that study entail, and what did your team discover?
Yeah, maybe if we can back a few. There we go. Okay, great. So this was a desk analysis that we had commissioned and worked through, looking at what would happen if carbon capture retrofits were installed on, it was 2 different cement facilities and then 2 fluidized catalytic cracking units at 2 refineries, 1 each in California and Texas. And this was looking at really what needed to be done to the existing pollutants at the facility. So not necessarily trying to reduce pollutants at the facility, but what would we need to do to the pollutants at the facility to effectively operate the capture equipment? So we looked at, of course, the CO2 emissions, and then a couple other main conventional air pollutants at these facilities to see what you would need to do to effectively operate that capture equipment. The slide that we're all looking at here is the CO2. So we looked at a 90% capture rate at each facility, but we also took into account the increased energy required to operate the capture equipment. So this got us to an 87% reduction in CO2 emissions at each facility, totaling over 5 million tons per year of reduction in CO2. This is combined across the 4 facilities. Again, 2 refineries and then 2 cement plants. Just to make sure that we're all looking at this graph correctly, we've got for each graph that we look at, each slide, it will be the emission reductions on the y-axis, and then we have each of the facilities on the x-axis across. The dark blue is the current emissions at each facility, and then that green is what we would see if carbon capture were to be installed at the facility. So if we can go to the next one, Joey. I'll take you through one of the pollutants at a time that we looked at in the analysis. The first one is particulate matter. This again is what we would need to do in terms of reductions of that pollutant at the facility to effectively operate the capture equipment. So we can see a drastic reduction in particulate matter at each facility. This is greater than 90% reduction, totaling nearly 1,000 tons per year at the facilities combined in terms of reductions in particulate matter. If we go on to the next slide, we look at nitrogen oxides. So this is nitrogen oxide and NO2, so nitrogen dioxide reductions. Not quite as large. Again, we weren't trying to reduce these pollutants, but this is what you would need to have reduced at each facility. And even though they aren't as drastic as we saw for the particulate matter, we're still seeing over 500 tons per year in reductions of nitrogen oxides combined across the facilities. And then the last slide here is the most impressive that we see for all of the pollutants that we looked at. Greater than 99% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions at each facility, totaling over 3,000 tons per year of reductions in sulfur dioxide. The reduction is so drastic that you can't even really see that bar for the SO2 emissions on the plot, really showing how impressive of a reduction that is. I also do just want to point out, we also, I don't have a graph for this, but we also looked at the volatile organic compound emissions because we looked at the industry standard right now of an amine solvent. And you do get some amine slip from these facilities. And so we are, of course, seeing a very drastic reduction in multiple harmful air pollutants, but we also, in our analysis, saw a small increase of about 2.5 to 3 tons per year in volatile organic compound emissions. Of course, not trying to reduce pollutants, so this didn't take into account if you were to try to minimize that increase in volatile organic compounds, but we did still, with our analysis, see a small increase that is very much dwarfed by these very large decreases that we're seeing from the other pollutants.
You also looked at the potential health impacts of these emissions reductions using the EPA COBRA model. Can you speak to those impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. And these were, I didn't include a graph here, but these were also really important to analyze too, right? It's great to talk about how we're reducing these air pollutants, but what's really important, in addition to the slowing of climate change, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, when we are looking at these reductions in air pollutants, we're also seeing huge health benefits, especially when you're installing carbon capture on a really, really dirty facility and needing to have a lot of those improvements in air quality. We're seeing between, combined with all 4 of these facilities, up to around 80 lives saved each year, looking at either tens of millions up to hundreds of millions of total annual monetary health benefits from, just general improvements in people's health from not breathing in as many of these pollutants from the facilities.
Thank you. One thing that, a couple of things that I think were important and interesting in this study. One is that each facility is unique and different. It's not going to be the same equipment or the same results for every facility. You also considered the energy impact, is that right? Or of the steam that goes onto the capture unit, that powers the capture unit, so that's incorporated into the results.
Yes.
And you also considered the costs of CCS to the facilities that you studied. So what were the cost sensitivities and how do they compare to those health benefits?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what is kind of interesting is that the more the more health benefits we get, because the more air pollution controls that you have to install, say, for that huge reduction in sulfur dioxide, for the huge reduction we're seeing in particulate matter, that does increase the cost, right? Because you're having to install more equipment to get a cleaner flue stream to properly operate the equipment. And that, of course, is why we're starting to see some of the earlier adopters be from industries that have the cleaner flue streams in general. But you're also getting that huge health benefit to the communities as well. And one of the important things that we saw from the report is that even when you're installing more and more air pollution control equipment, cleaning up that flue stream, sometimes when we were, of course, an apples and oranges comparison, but when you're comparing the actual cost of the carbon capture retrofit to that annual monetized health benefit that we're getting to the community, for some of these facilities, the health benefit, if you're looking at it from a monetary side, is larger than the actual cost of installing the carbon capture retrofit, which I think is, even though an odd comparison, is still an important aspect to point out for those communities who are benefiting from that cleaner air.
Thank you very much. This study and others that are out there, Great Plains Institute has a similar study out, I think are really important to communicate to the public, to let them know that this is probably going to help their community in many ways. And to speak to that, Jack, I'd like to chat with you for a minute. At Breakthrough Energy, you see a lot of what's happening in the energy transition. You're seeing a variety of energy technologies and projects being deployed across the country and the world. Can you share with us some of your experience and perspective about how CCS and CDR can bolster communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to say thanks to the Global CCS Institute and Jared and the team for having me in. I love the work that you guys are doing. Look forward to the report every October, like a kid on Christmas. Waiting for it to drop. So yeah, I think when you look across the U.S. and the world as it relates to CCS, particularly, it's important to look at the counterfactuals for any given facility or an industry. And most of the time when I hear pushback on CCS, it's things like, oh, we don't need it. And my next question is then, well, what is your plan for cement, steel, pick your industry? And that's sort of where the conversation stops, because there really isn't a good one for a lot of sectors. And even within sectors where we potentially do have new technologies, like green steel, like electric steel that can be powered by hydrogen, that won't be true of every steel facility in the world. And so just for a pointed example, look in Hagerstown, Maryland, there's a cement facility that has like 100-year plant lifetime coming up. And that sort of capital investment and outlay is not something that can just be sort of shuttered down. I mean, that's not really how that works. And so the counter example is not that these facilities will shut down, it's that they will just keep emitting CO2 without CCS. So there really are, for a lot of these facilities, sort of two options, especially in the short to medium term. And I think that's a good place to start from, because then you go to the communities that are receiving this pollution, right, or are subjected to it. And the most important thing that we've seen across the board, whether it's CCS projects or direct air capture projects, is you have to start from a place of trust. And you can sort of work down on like what the actual community wants and what the benefits they would like to receive from that sort of project. But if you don't have trust within the community, it doesn't really matter what sort of benefits you can put forward. These communities who are receiving these technologies are not dumb. They cannot be bought off. That's not how this works. But you go across the United States and you look at different communities, and there's obviously pretty disparate outcomes. You look in Louisiana with a lot of skepticism down there, very rightly so. I mean, they've had decades of negative health impacts associated with fossil fuel extraction and refining. And then you go up to a place like Alaska, which is incredibly amenable to these technologies. And I know personally, I spent a summer in the Matanuska Valley in Alaska studying gold-crowned sparrows I know. It's the ornithology to carbon management pipeline is a lot stronger than you would think. There's probably dozens of us. But while I was up there, you can't help but notice as you're driving through, there's the local Chugiak High School BP football stadium. And these, if you're up in Alaska, you receive a dividend every year that is paid out by the oil and gas companies. And I'm not advocating for a dividend across every state, of course, but I'm saying that the oil and gas company went up to Alaska to thoughtfully engage with the communities and say, okay, how is this going to work? And that's just one example of how the carbon management community is very trusted and looked well upon up in Alaska. And they're excited about, and there's been recent announcements about potentially some CO2 from Japan coming over to Alaska for that very reason. And yeah, that varies by state to state. And so I think the first thing is you go to trust, and then you look at, what does a community actually need? And I think case studies for this are always really helpful because you can sort of gloss over and say like, oh, well, we can, fund this or we can build that. But you look at a place like Kingsville, Texas. So I was recently down in Kingsville with the folks over at 1.5 who've received DOE DAC Hub funding for the South Texas DAC Hub. And I sat in a room with community members from the mayor, the superintendent of the school district, a member of the faculty over at the Texas A&M Kingsville College, and all of them, and more community members, the judge was in attendance, and all of them had an example of how that project was actively engaging across all of their different domains to ensure that not only that project got built, but the benefits of that actually flowed back to the community, right? So they're doing a training program, partnering with Kingsville to make sure that folks who are in the community can be the ones to build and staff the actual facility. They're working with the Boys and Girls Club for sort of after school care as parents would potentially need help there. And so it's a great example of a community that's really excited. You talk to folks in Kingsville and they're ready for the DAC Hub to get in and built. And I think the most interesting thing about that whole community engagement project is that actual project is on a private ranch miles outside of Kingsville. And so this is an example of, truly, you could potentially say, hey, the community is the ranch, and that's it. But that's not what Oxy 1.5 did. They really had a long-going discussion with the folks that would be nearest affected to that, learned what they would need and what they wanted. I think it's a good, there's a number of news stories out there. I encourage everyone to go read them, but it's a good example of how this can be done right, because I think most of the time we hear about how it can be done wrong.
You touched on this in your comments, but I think it's an important perspective to have when we're considering carbon management, is that there's no silver bullet. I've heard, it's probably somebody in this room who said there's only silver buckshot. And we can't just do solar or geothermal or wind, or just do CCS. So given the work that you do with Breakthrough Energy, can you speak to where CCS and CDR make the most sense and where you see them having the biggest impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who may not know Breakthrough Energy, we're an organization that includes a number of sort of investment vehicles. We invest in early stage sort of lab bench-proven technologies. In our fellows program, helping those get to a pilot scale. We have a traditional venture capital investment team called Breakthrough Energy Ventures, all the way up to our Catalyst program, which is deploying project level finance on projects across the world. They've done 2 SAF facilities in the United States. They've done a long duration energy storage battery project up in Minnesota, another LDES project in Europe, as well as a green ammonia facility over there as well. And so we as an organization are looking for every technology under the sun in order to be able to decarbonize every sector. And so I think when you look at CCS, I mean, the first thing I'm looking at is, where is it unavoidable? And whether that's in a sector or a specific facility, where do we just not have cost competitive alternatives at the moment? And cement is, one that comes out a lot. Aviation is a great example of this. And so I think that I generally think about CCS and CDR not just in the macro of like what individual sectors are we going to need to put these on, but all the way down to the facilities. We touched on earlier about the difficulty of building infrastructure in the United States at the moment, and that includes transportation infrastructure and storage. And so there can be, creating a post-combustion facility on the back of a steel plant might be the lowest cost way to do it, unless, of course, you can't build a pipeline to storage. And then what do you do for that plant? Because again, the counterfactual is it's not shutting down. For cement, we make 8 million tons of cement a day globally. That's only going to increase, right? We're having more humans every year, and so we're going to need CCS or CDR, and in some cases both. And so as you look at that, then you look at okay, where can we sort of find a good cluster of industrial use cases for CCS, so we can make the unit economics of pipelines and storage better, and then where do we truly have emissions that we just can't clean up at the moment with something. And that's everything from aviation, which right now is incredibly difficult when you look at the cost of burning jet fuel versus the cost of e-fuels, right, or something like that, compared to all the way down to this sort of isolated cement plant or steel plant. How do you get those emissions out? If CCS is 90 to 95% efficient in capturing CO2, that's still 10 to 15% of emissions that are coming out every year that we have to get to net zero. And so I think, CDR in the long run obviously plays an incredibly critical role of removing legacy emissions as we get down, but it can also serve as a bit of a mop in the meantime to get us to net zero, as truly where are these emissions that we can't get through anything else, which I think is the most important piece, right? You can't use CDR as a way to just continue doing business as usual. And the deployment of these, in my opinion, I'm a policy person, so of course I think this, it all relies on policy. You hear over and over again, there's news story after news story, CCS is not deploying at the scale needed, which is the most self-evident and boring observation I've ever heard in my life, because it's like, well, sure, why? Like that, okay. And what's the answer? Is the answer that no one wants to do it, and folks are sort of wringing their hands behind the scenes, giggling about it? Like, no, it's because there's not currently a substantial amount of policy support or financial incentives to do so. And that's sort of it, full stop. If it is not profitable for an organization to do this, or regulated that you have to, then no one's going to clean up these emissions. That's just not how, that's not how it works. And so I think that if we do want to see the deployments that we all know we need, whether it's in CDR or CCS, you need a robust policy and regulatory scheme to incentivize it to be done. And until that's in place, we won't see it. There's a great steps forward in the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA. DOE has been doing a heroic effort in getting money out the door, money well spent, but we've got a long way to go.
This question, I'll ask you, Jack, but any of you feel free to chime in on this. Are there particular arguments that you've heard or myths that you see out in the public square that we need to do a better job at responding to? Like, what facts do we need to get out there?
Yeah, I've already hit on the counterfactual one. That one to me is most pressing. It's just, I frequently ask folks, like, what is your plan, if not for CCS on this sector or facility? And I think that sort of cuts right to the heart of it. I think, I'll take privileges. My background is in storage, ornithology to storage, again, it's classic. And I did some policy and regulatory work, and then just a little bit of technical work. I wish I was a geologist, but I'm not. And did some technical work on the best sandstone in the US, the beautiful Mount Simon. I think that the narrative around geologic storage to me is so incredible, because it has one of the most amazing safety track records of any climate technology. Hundreds of millions of tons stored underground for decades, no major leaks across continents, across the world. We're doing this, and it's not just safe, it's incredibly safe in a number of different geologies at various depths. I mean, you name the thing that has sort of been, we've been working on research, and we've done it so far. And even when there are reports out there was the report issued on Sleipner and Snøhvit, and in Norway, the report sort of tried to hint at that maybe these weren't safe, and then the report went on to detail exactly how Sleipner and Snøhvit managed every single technical issue that they had on the project perfectly, and the CO2 remained underground. I mean, it was truly like the exact opposite, I think, of what the report wanted to do, but it was really incredible. And so I think the narrative is that the argument that I most encounter that, yeah, we need to work on is just the safety of geologic storage and understanding that, of course, it sounds wild. Like talking to my own mother about this, and I'm like, yeah, I work on like pressurizing a gas, a supercritical fluid, and then you just like drill a hole, it's like 8,000 feet underground, and then you push that into a rock. And like just on its face, that does sound a little silly for those of us who don't do it. But that is over and over again, the thing that we get most pushback on.
So I used to work in CCS before I became an academic at the ripe old age of 50, including running one of the world's first early stage CCS projects back. Jared was running FutureGen, I was running ZeroGen in Australia. It's true that when you have the right reservoir, it's safe. I think we overestimate just how much reservoir capacity is in the world. I don't think we could explore, appraise, and prove up the reservoirs needed to get to 20 gigatons by 2050 because of the exploration and appraisal process is a fairly long one if we want to do it safely. Interestingly, I've been now talking recently to a range of these NGO and landowner groups who are opposing CCS infrastructure. And I thought, they asked me, about plumes and where it goes, and I thought they were talking about the subsurface. They were all concerned about pipeline ruptures. That was something I hadn't realised was front of mind for a lot of these people. So I think as developers, we have to get much more sophisticated in how we communicate risk. The modelling we do around risk events, particularly pipeline ruptures, and also be transparent about that. So my sense is the industry is not being as transparent with local communities as it could be. And in my experience, the minute you're not transparent is the minute you build distrust. And I think trust is critical, but if you start from a position of distrust, then it's really hard to pull it back. So I think that'd be my observation.
Yeah. Maybe a couple things. I got to sit here and think about all the all the things I could say while everyone else was speaking. I'll say first, as a geologist, it is a little wild to actually think of a catastrophic release of CO2 from 8,000 feet underground. I can't really fathom in my head how that would happen. And I even say that as when I was young, I used to fear that there would be an earthquake that would happen and it would swallow me into the earth. But now that I've grown and learned, I realize that isn't going to happen. And from the other side, the CO2 will not be released as a giant explosion back out into the surface. The other one, of course, I'll say, since we went through this air pollutant study, a lot of people still really speak about the increase in emissions that we'll get from installing carbon capture because of the increased energy requirements. And so I think we have a long way to go of one, explaining these reports that are starting to come out, the Clean Air Task Force one, the Great Plains Institute one. There's also a recent journal article from Gary Rochelle that looks at air pollution associated with carbon capture retrofits on coal-fired power plants, really explaining that we're really starting to see that there will be a reduction in air pollutants. And I think we also need to get more and more projects that are really showing that to communities as well. The last new piece I'll add is also that we see a lot of discussion now about capture rates not being achieved at facilities who have spoken to what % capture they plan to do at their facility. But a lot of times the pushback is looking at the entire facility and what percentage of capture they're actually doing relative to the actual point source that is being captured. And so I think we have some room to grow with educating the public, educating other groups on when we're talking about a capture rate, what part of a facility we're looking at, and better able to trying to really show the successes that we're seeing here and finding easy ways of explaining that to people.
I think we all have to be mindful as well when we're communicating with the public is little terms that is sort of scientific jargon for us and we understand them and don't fear them. A word like plume or supercritical, maybe really, it may cause fear in somebody who's not a scientist. So there's a lot of nuance to how we communicate, and we all need to pay attention to even those small details. Let's take the remainder of the time to open it up to the audience for question and answer. So if anyone has a question, we have a couple of folks with mics who can come to you. And if you don't mind, let's wait for the mic to arrive. Here's one up in front. Steve has a question. Just one second. There. Aaron's coming with the mic.
She called me a frequent caller. That really hurts. So, Angela, this is a question for you, and maybe you said it and I missed it. But on the criteria pollutants and the reduction, is that primarily from polishing, I'll call it polishing, up front of the CCS unit, or are you seeing some of that in the CCS unit itself? Because back when I was looking at this more deeply than I am now, the idea was to polish it to reduce the O&M cost on the CCS unit. That has not changed?
Yeah, and so the SO2 reductions and the particulate matter reductions, vast majority of those are from installing capture equipment upstream of the carbon capture retrofit. The nitrogen oxide reductions, that some of that is from being absorbed into the amine solvent, and so what we were looking at with the cement and the refineries, there were good options for air pollution control on the sulfur dioxide and the particulate matter. The nitrogen oxides, some of that did end up being absorbed into the amine solvent because there wasn't a good option for air pollution control upstream. So majority of that is from installing additional controls, but it can depend on what is available for an air pollution control there. But you are right. You want to avoid having as much of that being absorbed into the amine because it is detrimental, and that's really the main reason that you need to do that cleaning up of the flue stream before it goes to the capture equipment.
Did you look at mercury?
We did not look. I don't think that we looked at mercury. We looked at both filterable and condensable particulate matter, and some of the condensable particulates included some hazardous air pollutants that are associated with condensable particulate matter. Those were reduced at the same percentage as our overall particulate matter, but I don't think that we looked at mercury specifically.
But typically, you'd have to put a separate mercury trap if you've got pretty high mercury in your coal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Beth Hardy-Valiaho from the International CCS Knowledge Center. Just to add a context, at the Boundary Dam facility in Canada, 100% of the SO2 is taken out in that process ahead of time. 50% of the NOx comes out, and large amounts of particulate matter, 2.5 and 10 as well. And so the value of taking out the CO2 the SO2, sorry, is really important in getting to the CO2, because What ended up happening after 3,000 operating hours is that the amine began to rapidly degrade. And so the SO2, it was what was causing the degradation to accelerate. And so we have all of that data. We've worked with CATF on this as well. But all of that information on the coal plant and the emissions that have to come out ahead of time before even getting to the CO2, all of that is public information, and we're always happy to help. Yeah.
Yeah, and we love seeing stories like that and hearing about it more.
There's one question on the side over here.
Thanks. I'm Tobias Schweitzer. I'm working for ERA, which is Artificial Intelligence Research and Analytics, and we made some quite good correlations for especially nitrogen oxides in the field of biochar production, which is pyrolysis. And I'm here to understand what are the challenges in the CCS and global. And you were talking about a lot of equipment which needs to be installed, and I was thinking about, is it hardware equipment or is it also software? Are you working with AI machine learning to find out any correlations and how to get the optimum out of your carbon capture?
So I will say we don't necessarily operate carbon capture equipment at Clean Air Task Force. We did have this desk analysis commissioned out to see what would need to be specifically installed at these facilities. And this was hardware air pollution control that would be needed at these facilities. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has further information on how much is being used for AI or anything like that, and looking at what else could be done to clean up the flue streams.
I mean, to the first part of your question, it is capital intensive. Like it's a lot of hardware that you have to install. It needs to be automated. I don't know of any people working in the role of AI on making it work more efficiently, but no doubt there are opportunities there.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with in the actual facility itself, but I know that AI is being currently deployed to look at different solid sorbents and liquid solvent potential chemistries for a more efficient capture. So MOFs is like the example that gets used over and over again. Is MOFs have a checkered past of success as a capture medium, and now AI is allowing the faster processing of looking at which sort of MOFs, not just chemical composition, but also physical structure for capture efficiency.
I think we might have time for one more question. There's one in the back. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And thank you especially for starting off with a focus on community engagement and social acceptance. I wanted to ask what you see as the opportunities for the CCS industry to work with the broader clean energy industries to learn from experiences in building up community support for projects, and also to help change the broader narrative that we need more good infrastructure, we need more transmission, we need CCS, we need all of it. What are the opportunities to work with that broader community?
I think we have a lot to learn from clean energy deployment. It's already been mentioned a few times on this panel, but the real pushback to building anything is happening. I think it's easy to take it pretty personally when you work on carbon capture and CO2 pipelines, but we aren't alone in this issue by any means. And so I think we have a lot of lessons to learn looking at success stories of where we have them from building out wind turbines, solar facilities, transmission lines, seeing what kind of policies have worked at the local level, the state level, to try to learn from either the mistakes of building out clean energy infrastructure or from successes that we've seen in that industry.
Certainly, we're a university, we have limited reach, but we certainly work across the disciplines, lots of social science and psychology, We work with communities who host wind and transmission. We're trying to get more engaged in the carbon capture area. I think there's a huge opportunity. There's, you know, there is resistance on both sides to engage, I think, authentically with the other. You know, the renewable energy sector with the CCS industry. And I think NGOs are sort of lining up behind the two sectors more in a more partisan way. So we've got some work to do, but I think it would be a great step forward if the decarbonisation ecosystem was working as one.
Yeah, just finally, I mean, we're in Washington, D.C. There's a number of very thoughtful ENGOs and NGOs who are in D.C. right now who are working on this. Dr. Simone H. Stewart is in the room from NWF. She's an incredible, not just advocate for the technology, but doing so in a way that works not just for the folks trying to deploy it, but the communities that it will be deployed in. Dr. Rudra Kapila over at Third Way is another notable advocate and sort of expert in this arena. So I would say that I'm happy to chat with you after this about, you know, different organizations that are really leading the work here. But there are a number of them out there.
I'm going to shamelessly plug a paper the Institute's going to publish this week about CO2 pipelines, and the title of it is Building Our Way to Net Zero, and it's titled that because it's getting to net zero is not just a policy issue, like Jack mentioned earlier. It's certainly a policy issue, but it's also an infrastructure issue. We have to build transmission lines for the power. We have to connect point sources with storage sinks and so on. So we really do all have to work together as a net zero ecosystem. So I appreciate the question, and we do have a lot of work to do. So please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today. Thanks a lot.